So much for joining us today as we start this amazing conversation with women who are going to give an amazing perspective on what things have happened for women after 9/11 in many different areas. If we look at just women in Afghanistan and what they've gone through who are visibly Muslim and have been impacted by Islamophobia, we thought that it would be very helpful to have a panel discussion with women and having their perspective on the issues that are frontline and front and center dealing with Islamophobia. And today's discussion looks at the long-term legal, political, and media ramifications of 9/11 20 years later. We're so excited to have these amazing women here with me today. And I'm just going to go and introduce them to you one by one, and then we'll start our conversation. First, we have Senator Ghazala Hashmi, who is an Indian-born American politician and former academic administrator and educator. A Democrat, Senator Hashmi represents the 8th District in the Senate of Virginia. She is the first Muslim woman elected to the body. She has worked as an educator and academic administrator for 25 years before running for office. Welcome, Senator Hashmi. Next, we have Sanya Mansoor. She is a reporter at Times who covers Muslim Americans and voter rights. Next, we have Gwen Aviles, is a senior reporter covering race and identity at Insider. While she writes about a variety of topics, including education, politics, and arts and culture, she is most passionate about highlighting the stories of underrepresented and marginalized groups. Prior to working at Insider, Gwen worked as a reporter for NBCnews.com and as a freelance reporter for various publications. She holds a bachelor's degree in English from Cornell University and master's degree in journalism and communications from Northwest University and Columbia University. Welcome, Gwen, and welcome Sanya as well. Next, we have Noreen Nasa. She is a video journalist with the Associated Press Race and Ethnicity team and is based in Chicago. Noreen joined the AP in 2015 in Washington, D.C. Before that, she was a reporter/producer for the PBS NewsHours. Welcome, Noreen. And last but not least, we have Rana Abdul Hamid. She's a graduate of Middlebury College, Truman Scholar, and attended Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. For the last few years, she's worked to create economic opportunity and safety for women through technology, utilizing her job at Google while running Malika, a nonprofit dedicated to women's empowerment and social justice. She is currently running for Congress in New York's 12th district. Welcome, ladies. Welcome, Rania. Thank you so much for being here today. So we're going to hand over the highlight to Senator Ghazala to start us off with a few words.
Thank you so much, and assalamu alaikum. Thank you to everybody who's joining us, and it's just a wonderful privilege to join such an esteemed panel. And one thing that struck me as you were doing the introductions is how many of the individuals that we have joining here, the women who are going to be speaking here today, are really storytellers. They are, one way or another, sharing the experience of our broader Muslim community through media, through their personal insights. And I think this is absolutely necessary that we have opportunities to give voice to the experience of Muslims, particularly Muslims in America, and especially Muslim women. So I want to thank all of the wonderful panelists for the insights that they're going to be sharing with us. I wanted to reflect a little bit about this 20-year anniversary that we are now experiencing, the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And it's certainly a very grim anniversary, but it's also an opportunity for us to reflect on what has happened over the past 2 decades, how our lives have been changed or impacted by the experience of 9/11, and what that means for us, not just personally, but as a community and as a faith community in particular. I think for each of us who are here today, the experience of 9/11 resonated in powerful ways. As a community, as Muslim Americans, we were impacted doubly. We were impacted first as Americans and felt the trauma of that day, of that experience, just as keenly as any other Americans. We saw our country under attack. We saw our fellow citizens, our fellow neighbors and friends experiencing the trauma of that day. But we also experienced it as Muslims, and we also experienced the kind of aftermath of what happened on 9/11. We experienced another additional trauma of the scapegoating, of Islamophobia, of being targeted as individuals and as a community itself for the actions of others. And so this has been a particularly traumatic 2 decades for each of us. And I think for me personally, I feel that I am a little bit older than many of the panelists on here. And I experienced it as a mother too. I experienced it as a mother of 2 daughters who I knew were going to have to go back into a classroom and have to live their young lives with this now hanging over their heads, and reconcile it for themselves, reconcile it for themselves with their individual faith, and also be able to make sense of what it means for them as young American Muslim women. And so over the 2 decades, we've seen a lot of that evolution and a lot of that discussion. In many ways, I felt that our faith was hijacked by individuals who sought to commit violence in the name of our community, in the name of their own political issues that they had. But also our voice was in many ways taken from us by the broader media attention, by the narratives that ensued, by other people who got to tell our story. If there's a silver lining to be found in all of this experience, and I know it's hard oftentimes to find a silver lining, I think it is that we actually did find our own voice over the last several years. We found an ability to share our collective experiences, to identify ourselves individually as Muslim Americans, and to be able to discuss and to highlight the kind of collective responsibility feelings that we have as a community, and be able to articulate that. I think many of us did find power through the experience, that we found that we had a responsibility to speak for ourselves and to reclaim our faith and to represent the values that we certainly all espouse. One thing that I think 9/11 has taught us is that we have to be very deliberate about how we communicate and share our stories, that we have to push back any narratives that try to pigeonhole us or try to define us outside of the multitude of definitions that we have as Muslim Americans. And so in all of these ways, I think we've accomplished quite a bit in the last 20 years. I have seen power, I've seen resilience, I've seen a reclamation of our identities in so many ways. And I think one thing we'll see through the discussion this afternoon, through the wonderful panelists that we have here, is the very diverse ways in which our stories that need to be told are being told, in fact. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to listening to the discussion this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Senator Hashmi, for joining us and giving us such great words to live by, and your perspective and your viewpoints on what has happened. And we all can relate to that in so many different ways, and can see the human aspect of the issues that have arisen for women post 9/11. And I can, get on your bandwagon as much as I can get on anyone else's here who's going to be speaking, because as women, we are usually marginalized in so many different other aspects as well. But 9/11, I think, puts a whole different coating on that. So thank you so much for joining in, for your wisdom. I'm going to move over to our next speaker and have questions. But before that, for those of you watching on Facebook or on Zoom, if you have questions, please feel free to throw it down in the chat or in the comment section, and we'll get to that at the end of the program, hopefully. So one person here who can speak to the importance of how both 9/11 has shaped her life is Rana Hamid. You were a victim of hate crime, which, in turn, pushed you to empower American Muslim women and in the Muslim community in general. Can you share with us some details about your experience and how this led you to where you are today and your viewpoints and the trajectory of where you're planning on going in life because of your own experiences?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. And also, like other folks said, I feel really lucky to be in a space with other women, Muslim women who, share similar experiences. So I grew up in New York City post 9/11. I was 8 years old when the attacks happened. And it was, as a Muslim New Yorker, it was a double challenge in the sense that my city, right, experienced this act of violence in which many members of my community were either in Manhattan at the time, nearby, or were first responders. And at the same time, my community became the victim of state-sanctioned violence. So overnight, it was we were at fault, and it manifested through the ways in which police violence, NYPD surveillance, stop and frisk, deportation, detention of folks in my community. And this actually brought me to organizing at a really young age. As a 14-year-old, I was activated in my community really from a place of deep love for my neighborhood community, which is a working class immigrant neighborhood, and also from a place of deep frustration. And I myself, as you mentioned, experienced a hate-based attack as a hijab-wearing Muslim woman walking down the street in Queens when I was assaulted by a man who tried to take off my hijab. And at this time, I felt very isolated, very alone in my own skin. And at the same time, I had been doing karate since I was 7. And so was able to get away from this moment, but then thought about this moment for a really long time and thought about my own presence in my community and in my own city. And through a lot of my mentors and just women in my life, was guided to really think about how I could use that moment to maybe do something for others who might experience something similar. And so I started out of the basement of a community center in my neighborhood, training women in self-defense. And we literally came up with a technique called a hijab grab technique, teaching women how to defend themselves from hijab grabs and de-escalating different forms of public violence. And for the past 10 years, that's been kind of my life's work in organizing, in healing justice, in fighting for minoritized people's rights across our communities. And that's definitely led me to the work that I'm doing today, because I am right now running for Congress for the same neighborhood, to represent the same neighborhood that was a target of that type of violence, that experienced very similar acts of hate-based violence, anti-Muslim violence across the board, against a sitting incumbent who many of you probably know as the woman who wore a burqa on the House floor to advocate for the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan under this double narrative that Muslim women and that propagated this gendered Islamophobic narrative, right? Muslim women are a threat, Muslim women are oppressed, which results in the type of violence that I experienced. And so I feel really lucky and very fortunate to be able to step into my power, really rooted in this reclamation and really rooted in a vision for what is possible for safety that moves beyond the ways in which our communities have been mischaracterized for so long. So yeah, I think a lot of my story, especially as a Muslim New Yorker, is very much rooted in that day, in the aftermath of 9/11.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Rana. And as a fellow New Yorker, that resonates with me as well. I grew up in Queens, New York City. So when 9/11 happened, it was like, oh my God, I have to hide now. And that's pretty much what I had to do. I was 5 months pregnant with my second child, and I was forced to be out of the public eye for a while because I was afraid for my life and afraid what I had to go through. And I find it really encouraging and so inspirational that you decided to take it upon yourself to start this, self-defense class, because we don't think about those things, right? We don't feel like we even need that. Why should we need it? But now that we have to do it, it's like, wow, we're at a point where we need to do this to take care of ourselves. And it's kind of an empowering, but at the same time, sad moment as well, that we have to fend for ourselves in that way. So kudos to you and all the work that you're doing and your political aspiration. Best of luck to you on that. I'm going to move over to Gwen. You've written about a generation of Muslims, growing up in the shadow of 9/11, either not being born or even very young when 9/11 happened. And both you and both Sanya and Noreen can relate to this in some aspect as well. But Gwen, does anything stand out with you in this perspective of those who, lived through 9/11 and then the generation after? What did you notice? What were the trends? What was it that was connecting people or maybe disconnecting people from 9/11?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first I want to say thank you, Rana, for sharing your story. And I think that is something I noticed when reporting this story, is how activated young Muslims are to really change the narrative, really fight back against this injustice that they've been facing, this Islamophobia over the years. And it's incredible that, the people I spoke to were actually, the majority of them hadn't even been born when this tragedy happened. So for them to grow up in the shadow of this incident and to be exposed to it through most of them were exposed to it, learned about it through some sort of hateful incident that occurred to them. And then they had asked their family or maybe a teacher about it. Sometimes even this, a hatred and racism was propelled by their educators when the educators were doing lessons on 9/11. So these incidences unfolded in every area of their life, from the school to their own neighborhoods. They didn't feel safe whatsoever anywhere. But I think one thing that really stuck out to me, one really alarming statistic, the JAMA Psychiatry Journal did a study analyzing suicide ideation among young people of different religions. And they found that of the respondents, Muslims actually had the highest rate of recording that suicide ideation. And they linked it to the increased hate that they received and the increased incidents that they received, in comparison to, let's say, Catholics who had a lesser recording of experiencing this hate. So that's pretty alarming to just see the mental health effects among young Muslims. Like, yes, we can, talk about, I apologize, my dog is barking in the background. We can talk about, the amazing things that young Muslims are doing. And I think that's where the focus should be, the work that they're doing, the way that they're changing the narrative and, making this world, seeing that their oppression is connected to other oppressions and other injustices across communities, and really working together to fight against these things. And I think that should probably be the main narrative, but also the mental health effects. We can't dilute that. We can't ignore that or look away from that, because this has taken a huge mental health toll on Muslims of all ages, particularly young Muslims.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think you hit that nail right on the head. And I have a 21-year-old and a 19-year-old daughter. And for them, being born after 9/11, they still see the repercussions of it. They still have the trauma of something they physically didn't experience, but they're seeing the ramifications of it afterwards. And I think that's an important key element to keep in mind, because it's not just static in a one particular time. Now, even 20 years later, we're still seeing the effects of it. And I think we'll see the effects of it for a long time. But we do have the power, I think, to change the narrative and change the focus and change the outcome of it, where we're growing as women, right? Where we're advocating for ourselves, like Rana wanting to go and into politics. Like, would you have done that had 9/11 not happened? I don't know. It could be a part of the process. So we can see things happening, but we can also use it to turn the narrative and change the future for the better. So I want to thank you for pointing that out. Sanya, I'm going to move over to you for a little bit. Now, you covered a pretty much similar situation about 5 years ago, which was 15 years after 9/11. Are you finding it that as time goes on, that the muscle memory of 9/11 is the same? Is it decreasing, increasing? How does that work in what you've seen and what you've come across? And then Noreen, please feel free to add to that as well after Sanya.
Yeah, so as a reporter, I feel like the effects of 9/11 have had really pervasive effects. And one thing particularly that I've looked into with my recent reporting are policies around surveillance and programs around surveillance. And I think part of the reason why this is so important when we talk about the legacy of 9/11 is that we're really talking about a disruption of trust. And we're really talking about effects on the way that Muslims then choose to engage or pull away from their faith based on the way that, for example, if you're in a mosque and you've learned that your mosque has been surveilled, not only now is there a trust deficit between you and and law enforcement, but then there's also a trust deficit between you and other community members at the mosque, because people that I've spoken to about these kinds of issues, have told me that, they sometimes feel a sense of paranoia, particularly if they were the ones, at that mosque. There's a sense of, okay, well, maybe I'll go to the mosque, but I won't engage as much. Or maybe one thing, for example, I was talking to someone from CARE, and they told me that, they heard, students pulling back from political engagement, or imams being told by their boards not to talk too much about social justice issues. So I think a lot of this actually ties back to, a lot of the ways that Muslims were othered after 9/11, and not just in terms of, hate crimes or discrimination, but also in terms of structural policy, like when we talk about law enforcement, when we talk about, that the ways that the FBI has sometimes approached surveillance. Some experts say that, it is, encroaching on civil liberties. So I feel like it's very much, the effects are very much pervasive today. That's not to say that, Muslim Americans aren't doing anything about it. There are a lot of people, educating each other and politically active on this issue. But I do think that it's important to know that this wasn't just something that happened 20 years ago, but that the policies born out of that time still very much affect the way that Muslims engage with their religion today.
Thank you so much for that, Sanya. That's really insightful. Noreen, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure, yeah. I think, Sanya, you kind of hit the nail on the head. I feel like when we talk about the impact, especially of the war on terror in the wake of 9/11, this continues to have some very real structural policies that impact the Muslim community today, and has throughout the last 20 years. I think a lot of things that took place, especially in those early months and years after 9/11, we tend to forget. A couple years ago when Donald Trump was running for office, there was a lot of talk about a Muslim registry in a way that people thought that this was something that had never occurred before. In fact, this was something that was in place for several years in this country. In 2002, in September, a year after 9/11, the war, a part of the war on terror, a policy that was kind of, implemented through this war on terror, was called the National Security Entry Exit Registration System, NSEERS, which essentially is a Muslim registry, some called it. There were 25 countries on a list, and basically all male non-citizens 16 and above from this list of 25 countries had to register with the federal government. Every single one of those countries, except for one, North Korea, was a Muslim majority country. So this was something that was actually in place, that not only did it not lead to a single terrorism related case, it also, what it actually led to was just the deportation of hundreds of these young and older men who were living in this country, and oftentimes their only violation was a civil immigration violation. Rana also alluded to these deportations, these detentions that were happening around the New York metropolitan area. So in the weeks after 9/11, there were Muslim men who were basically just disappearing off of the streets of New York and the surrounding New York, New Jersey area. Nobody knew what was happening to them. Fahad Ahmed, who is the executive director of a group called DRUM, which stands for They Seize Rising Up and Moving, an organization that's worked a lot with particularly South Asian working class immigrants in the New York area, said that, oftentimes when we talk about sometimes the effects that 9/11 had on a Muslim generation, tend to kind of focus on stories and perspectives of, more educated folks, people like me, like maybe a hijab wearing like millennial who is educated and professional, and has had to deal with definitely some, very real you know, instances of Islamophobia or discrimination, but that I have the power and the ability to kind of maybe bounce back from that. But there's a whole swath of people who were in this country or are still in this country that didn't have that ability. So a lot of working class people, especially in, like, you know, Rana mentioned the New York metropolitan area, who were very severely affected by this. Again, just literally just picked up off the street. Nothing, just no reason was given to them. Placed in detention, often solitary confinement for months, and their families had no idea where they were. And you know, they were brutalized, they were verbally abused in these prisons, and in the end, again, it was just civil immigration violation, and then they were deported back to their home country. So these are the things where it's like, you know, you have like a 14-year-old at the time, I was 13, a 14-year-old who came home from school and his father is missing and he has no idea where he is. And then the family struggles over the course of, like, you know, basically a year and a half while their father is in solitary confinement in Brooklyn. And they have no financial support. And in the end, the entire family has to go back to Pakistan while they wait for their father to be deported back to their home country as well. And these are families who are just trying to survive and live, and, you know, drove taxis or were truck drivers, or, you know, basically were paid their taxes, you know, and were working alongside so many other New Yorkers. But their fate was severely impacted by some of these policies that were implemented. So those are definitely, I think, sometimes the stories that people tend to forget about, and they sort of evolve and they pop back up in different ways, like we saw just over 4 years ago with Talk About a Muslim Registry.
Thank you so much, Noreen. That was a lot of great information, and I'm tying that back to what both you and Sanya were talking about is 9/11 and this idea of surveillance after 9/11 and long-term implications. I want to talk about that because we talked about the surveillance happening at that time, but now what are the long-term implications of these things for people who were either in solitary confinement, who were brought here and then taken back, who have, you know, pretty much some of them stripped out of the dignity that they hold? What would you classify their status now as a 20-year later implication of what they've gone through? And Sanya, you can start.
Yeah, sure. So I will maybe speak specifically about, and this is tied to a recent story I did in Southern California in the mid-2000s, where the FBI had sent an informant to a mosque in Southern California. I feel like the long-term effects there, you know, there were some people who interacted with the informant who presented himself as a convert, who, you know, really took him in, as often, you know, when new converts come to mosques, they're welcomed. And for a lot of those people who took that person in and, you know, divulged information about themselves, and who were close to him, and ended up, you know, having some interactions with the FBI, nothing really concrete came out of any intelligence that the informant had gathered. But I had heard from people I had interviewed that those people had kind of, you know, left the state, or their family, you know, were having difficulties with their family, or difficulties kind of just being a part of that community anymore on the most direct level. But again, like, I would come back to like those long-term effects. I think one of the tricky things is we don't always know the scope of surveillance. Like, it isn't very obvious, like, what is happening where. One of the most current forms that this manifests in is that the FBI, for example, has voluntary interviews where, you know, they will show up to people's homes and often Muslim American people's homes, and ask them about everything from, you know, what is being spoken about at their mosque to their political views. And these can sometimes, based on my reporting and conversations with people who, Muslim Americans who work to, you know, on like FBI Know Your Rights workshops and educating others that these instances can often feel very intimidating for Muslim Americans. So I feel like a lot of this in my mind still circles back to that pushing Muslim Americans to like disengage from their religion in some way.
Yeah, and I think that also has implications between relationship between the Muslims and law enforcement, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think that was already a tense relationship to begin with. And like, I feel like when we talk about the relationship of Muslims towards law enforcement, like, I think we have to remember that Muslims are not a monolith. So like, are we talking about Black Muslims? Are we talking about immigrant older Muslims? Like, I think, you know, within the Muslim community, you have much more progressive Muslims who are pro-abolition, who are, you know, for giving, who are, you know, advocating that, you know, a part of zakat can be given, you know, can align with abolition. And then I think you have maybe other sometimes older immigrants who, you know, based on my reporting in previous stories, like may have the mindset that they don't really want to create trouble. Like they've come to a new country. They don't want to get in trouble with law enforcement. And I feel like that's like a really thorny issue within the community where there's a lot of disagreement over it. But yeah, I think it's definitely fair to say that it's a tense relationship, and after 9/11, it's only become more and more strained.
Thank you. Noreen, you want to add anything to that?
I forgot the initial question, but
long-term effects of surveillance after 9/11 in terms of what we're seeing, the aftermath of all of those surveillance now, 20 years later, what are we seeing in terms of that surveillance? And then also adding to the, you know, relationship between law enforcement and the Muslim community.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sanya kind of hit all of the points, you know, that, but I think I would also say that, you know, surveillance was kind of, it was definitely, I think there is a lot of emphasis that is put on 9/11 when we talk about surveillance, but that surveillance was kind of already occurring in some mosques even before 9/11. And I think that that's, you know, there's, for example, there's the Bridgeview community in the Chicago area. And there's this really great documentary that I would encourage everyone to watch called The Feeling of Being Watched that takes place in that community. And, you know, the director of the film really goes into a lot of detail about how this was an issue before 9/11, that her community of primarily Arab Americans in this suburb of Chicago was definitely being surveilled before 9/11 even happened. And so, you know, there is, I think, again, like a lot of emphasis placed on that one event, but I think we have to remember that this was an issue even before, and clearly continues to be an issue today.
For sure, for sure. I'm going to pick your brain a little bit more, Noreen, while I have you here. There's definitely an undertone of, you know, the government not doing enough, and a lot of people are definitely saying that, and what that represents, especially when we look at it with the Sikh community not being included as categorized as hate crimes statistics until 2015. Or a general tension between law enforcement and Muslims, like we talked about in the issue of surveillance and secret evidence. Any thoughts on why this is the case from law enforcement side? Like, why would it take so long to look at what has happened to the Sikh community as hate crime? Why would it take that long? Was it just like they were just being super hyper vigilant, or do you think they were just being ambivalent to it, or was there a nefarious thought process in that altogether? I just want to like pick your brain on that, and in terms of what you felt was going on.
Well, I spoke to a lot of Sikh Americans around the 20th anniversary of 9/11 to see how, you know, the 20 years since it had impacted that community. And what the Sachit Gaur, the executive director of the Sikh Coalition, what she said was that, you know, unfortunately, sometimes it takes a very traumatic event for federal officials to act. So the Sikh community, the Sikh Coalition, was formed in the wake of 9/11 as sort of a response to kind of, you know, have a representative voice for this community in the US. And early on, they really made a push for the federal government, for the FBI to start tracking hate crimes against their community. But it took a really long time. It wasn't, like you said, until 2015 that it was officially starting to get tracked by the FBI. We may remember that in 2012, there was this horrific attack on a Sikh temple, Gurdwara in Wisconsin, Oak Creek, Wisconsin, that killed 8 members of that community. And so it was in the wake of that, that a lot of, attention was then put to, okay, maybe we should try to actually see if we can classify these hate crimes for this community, even though the ask was there and the push was there and there were voices that were being raised. And there might be others who might be more qualified to speak on, the way that the government sometimes works on that. But yeah, that was definitely a frustration. And this is a community that has been very severely impacted in the wake of 9/11 when it comes to hate crimes, being especially men who wear turbans, being very visible on the street, often being mistaken for Muslim men. And so there was this just perpetual kind of like fear and paranoia that existed within that community. And they also, the community, and especially the Sikh coalition, really tried to be a more visible force and advocate for the community. And it didn't always work until, again, like in 2012, people were like hearing about the Sikh community for the first time. I mean, it wasn't until even the shooting at the FedEx facility in Indianapolis just several months ago that people even knew how to pronounce Sikh. A lot of people were mispronouncing it as Sikh. And so these are the kind of struggles that that community in particular has had over these last 20 years in this country.
Thank you so much, Noreen, for that. We have Shahid, who is the executive director of American Muslim Institution, who wants to chime in. So Shahid, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Just a quick question, especially as it relates to hate crimes, both for Noreen and Gwen. I wanted to ask you guys, do you think that the political leadership and media leadership, or the media in general, propagated an Islamophobic narrative about 20 years ago? And has that changed at all in the last 20 years? So on the political side, Rana; on the media side, Gwen.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Yes, actually, there's important research, I believe, from ISPU that shows that increase in hate-based attacks usually isn't tied to terrorist incidents or kind of shifts in general of like current events and what's going on in current events. It's actually tied to political election cycles, which shows you that oftentimes it is because of the dehumanization and normalization of violence towards certain communities by elected officials that oftentimes create these challenges and create these schisms between different groups to further their political agenda, that these communities will experience different levels of hate. And so I have seen, and we continue to see that. We've seen it with Trump, but we've also seen it even with the war in Afghanistan and the ways in which the conversation is unfolding, how there is this kind of normalization of violence against Muslim communities, and you see it extended through the global war on terror, right? And so I do think that you need kind of more effective political leadership that recognizes the weight and the harm behind their words, both towards Muslim communities, but communities across the board. I mean, you saw this with anti-Asian violence and the corona and COVID, and how it linked to increase in hate-based violence.
And for the media piece, I mean, I definitely think the media plays a huge role in perceptions of all marginalized groups, and that does affect whether these hate crimes persist or not. Something that really struck me when doing this reporting is, you know, a lot of the focus, rightfully so, is on 9/11, but there have been certain incidents, some that Noreen alluded to or spoke about, where there's discussion of Muslims. For instance, the Pulse shooting, the shooter of that was an Afghan man. And if the only time you're seeing Muslims represented in the news, or if the majority of the time you're seeing them represented is in a negative context of them perpetuating a crime or them doing something else that is deemed to be wrong, obviously that's going to affect the public perception of a whole group, even if this one person's action is not representative of that whole group. Media in general, you know, it's amazing to me to be on this panel to see like so many women of color, Muslim women, like in media, and it's great because just generally the media lacks diversity. It's a huge issue at all ranks, especially higher up. And the news does set the agenda. It does set the public perceptions of specific groups. So if you're not in the news, I don't think you're in the policy. It's all very much interconnected, and lack of news coverage or inadequate news coverage or inaccurate news coverage further marginalizes communities like Muslims. So based on what the people I've spoken to said, you know, that is changing slowly but surely, as we can see from the amazing people on this panel who are really, you know, telling the stories of Muslim communities. But given the underrepresentation of, you know, this group in the media, these stories are just not really being told.
Yes, Gwen, I completely agree with you. And you know, connecting that even to me being from New York, like Rana, and then being an Afghan who came here as a refugee after the Soviet invasion, you know, I had to hide my identity for a while after 9/11. You know, people would ask me and I'd be like, oh, well, what should I say? You know, do I tell them where I'm from? Or because I'm already persecuted for being a Muslim, visibly Muslim woman in my hijab, and I have to add another layer of, you know, protecting myself with my identity. And it became such a struggle that I actually used to refrain from even answering that question because I was afraid of how I was going to be perceived at or as the reaction that was going to come back to me. And a lot of Afghans did feel that after 9/11. And then even after, like you said, the Pulse shooting, it was just, oh God, another one. Now we have to hide even further. But, you know, the way the media did portray that, it didn't help us for a while. And, you know, I'm so glad to see women, Muslim women now in media representing and taking care of that narrative and taking the narrative in their hand. So it's a good force that's coming through. Sanya, I want to ask you a question and get your thoughts on the recourse available to American Muslims community, if there is any. You know, in your piece, you mentioned about, you know, judicial system. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the reasons why I focused on the case that I did in Southern California, it's called FBI versus Fazaga. So Imam Yasir Fazaga, he used to be at a mosque in Southern California. He, along with two other congregants in the Southern California area, ended up suing the FBI after they learned about surveillance occurring at their mosques. That case is now coming before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is scheduled to hear that in November. And so when we talk about what judicial recourse exists for those who have been surveilled, and particularly those who have been surveilled are, you know, Muslim communities, but also Black communities. And a real quick aside that I know that we talked earlier about some of this, but, you know, for example, COINTELPRO, like surveillance was, Muslims are not the only group that the US government had surveilled, you know. So COINTELPRO decades ago was used, you know, in the context of Black civil rights activists. And so that framework already existed there. But what we're talking about right now with the Fazaga case that's before the Supreme Court is about an issue of state secrets. So at the heart of this issue is basically the FBI is arguing that, you know, part of this investigation is so secret that not even judges can review some of the evidence. And so while Fazaga and the ACLU and CARE, who have sued, are alleging that their mosque and several other mosques were profiled solely on the basis of religion. The FBI isn't really engaging with that argument. More so, they're just saying that it's too sensitive to national security to have judges review this case. And so in my conversation with Ahilan Arulanatham, who's on Fazaga's legal team, he basically said the message here is that the courthouse doors are closed if the government views your community as a national security threat. So I think like that's what the implication here is that when we're talking about legal recourse, for many civil rights advocates, they feel that if the Supreme Court sides with the FBI here and agrees that, this, the evidence in this case is so secret for even judges to review securely, then I think for many Muslim Americans and civil rights advocates, they've expressed that that sets a dangerous precedent. And so I think that's something that's really top of mind right now.
Thank you for that. That's a lot to swallow and a lot to deal with, because it's one case, but the implications of it is so broad that it affects all of us. So hopefully things will go the right way. And thank you so much for sharing that with us, Sanya. So Gwen, we are seeing a terrible precedent potentially being created, as it relates to surveillance and what to and not to expect from law enforcement. In your piece, you had something interesting that you found, and that was the renewal of faith and activism in younger generations. Can you speak to that and why you think that may be the case? And also in your reporting in the past, you've looked at other marginalized communities. Do you see a certain overlap or differences between the two or more?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, this young generation, especially, they realize that they have to advocate for themselves, and that if they don't take it upon themselves to change things, this world is going to further, be an inhabitable place to live. One thing that really struck me with someone I was talking with, he's an educator who works with college students. And he told me that, the students that he works with see that their oppression is interconnected with the oppression of other groups. So they see, Black Lives Matter and Islamophobia as interconnected things. They see environmental racism as interconnected with Islamophobia. All of these compounding crises is something that these communities of young activists are realizing and are joining together in solidarity to combat and fight against. And it's really inspiring. I think they're really just trying to reclaim that power, as we were talking about earlier, and say, hey, I'm here. This is my voice. This is my community. Other people are trying to do everything they can to make me feel ashamed of my religion or how I was brought up or the person I am, but I'm proud of it. And that was so incredible to hear from some of the people I spoke about. They're not going to be, they are going to be visible and take up space for the people who can't take up space, for the people who are forced into a corner, who have to hide their identity, who can't proudly be who they are because they are very validly worried about their own safety. So it's really incredible to see these young people changing the tide. And even when it comes to just, prayer rooms on campus, how there's an inadequate amount of rooms where people can pray and practice their faith. They are talking to administration and advocating for those things and advocating for the food that they can eat. And it's these small things that, turn into the big things. I think you go from that to then changing the government and getting more representation in government. And, there's only been 4 Muslim Americans in Congress so far, but that's definitely going to be changing, in recent years.
Thank you so much for that, Gwen. I always tell my kids I was born 20 years too early. I should have been born this time so I could work with you guys a little bit longer, because I'm really inspired by the tenacity and energy that the younger generation has. And there's so much more, as my kids would say, woke, right? And aware of what's going on and the needs of the community. And I implore that. And I'm really honored to be here with all of you doing that work and really moving things forward. So from like an old auntie to you, thank you so much. Rana, I want to pose this question first to you, but Noreen and Sanya, please jump in if you have anything to add to that. You know, you worked with marginalized communities and you've seen the implications, like we talked about the implications of scrutinizing the Muslim community through surveillance and implications. But let's talk about that implication to all Americans, because, you know, we could say that Muslims are used to being surveillance a certain way, and they're the ones being targeted, but it also affects all the Americans. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think this really connects to a lot of the things that other folks have been saying just with regards to the intersectionality of all of these issues. I think it's Noreen's point that Muslim Americans did not just begin to be surveilled in a post 9/11 context, and that vantage point really takes or erases the reality of anti-Blackness in this country, the reality of activism in this country, where many organizers have been oftentimes undermined by government intervention and government surveillance tactics. And we saw that specifically within the context of Black Muslim communities engaged within the civil rights movement. And then you see it continuing, right, as many movements in this country that are fighting for progressive causes, social justice causes, are targeted by surveillance tactics. And we have reports on how the Black Lives Matter movement and members and leadership of Black Lives Matter movement for Black Lives were impacted in this way as well. And so I think that when we think about these issues and we think about the ways in which the Muslim community is being targeted or surveilled or discriminated against, oftentimes both tangibly, right, whether communities are mistaken for being Muslim and they are targeted. We know that the first person who was killed in an anti-Muslim act of violence was in fact not even Muslim, but rather was a Sikh South Asian man. So tangibly we see that, but also by extension of how the state apparatus continues to grow in the ways in which it controls communities that are historically and continue to be marginalized. And then I think, like, on a positive note, the opportunity there is that a lot of our communities now have a real responsibility to work together. And what's really beautiful here that I see in New York City with the evolution of leadership is that there is this beautiful alliance across various communities and a real understanding of solidarity, because we understand we're up against the same systems. And so that's kind of how I've seen it play out in my own work. And I continue to try to keep my work rooted in that as well.
Noreen, I'd love for you to jump in on this as well.
Yeah, I think that intersectionality, like Rana mentioned, is really key. We saw it in the wake of George Floyd's murder. You had sections of American public who had really never participated in that sort of a movement in the past, coming out into the streets in full force for the first time. I think a lot of Muslim Americans were among those people. Muslims, non-Black Muslims who, might not have been active in a Black Lives Matter protest in the past, showing up into the streets. I was in Minneapolis in the week after George Floyd was killed, and I saw, the diversity in the protests that were occurring at that time and have continued since. And so I think, again, I think there was this feeling, especially around the 2016 election, where a lot of people were feeling like, wait a second, a lot of this feels reminiscent of the feeling that Muslim Americans were having, that feeling of being otherized that Muslim Americans were having post 9/11. It was sort of happening again during the 2016 election. Rana mentioned that it's, this trend around political cycles, election cycles, where we see a rise in hate crime, we see a rise in just hateful rhetoric toward, different marginalized communities taking place. And so for a lot of Muslim Americans, that was a moment where they were starting to kind of feel that again. And I think in feeling that again, it was also this impetus for a lot of Muslim Americans to seek out, other marginalized groups and join forces, to sort of be a part of this like common fight or common narrative, and push back against some of the rhetoric that we saw at that time, and then sort of throughout that, the Trump presidency, we saw this like continuous surge of protests and movement, where there were a lot of people from just different swaths of American society coming together, and Muslim Americans were a part of that.
Yes, that definitely was a great impact that ended up happening, and seeing other people come into that conversation as well. So thank you so much, Noreen, for that. Sanya, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I think they really covered it, but I think it really just reminds me of like, for example, I mentioned earlier, like COINTELPRO, like, and, these are not entirely new frameworks. These surveillance programs aren't happening in a vacuum. Black communities particularly have been subject to this kind of surveillance for a really, really long time. And as history shows, and, many experts and civil rights advocates have pointed out parallels between, programs like COINTELPRO and other programs we have now, like, for example, like the Countering Violent Extremism program, CVE. And so, yeah, I would kind of just agree with what people have said here.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So I'm going to shift a little bit to Gwen, and I'm really curious about this aspect of the work that you're doing. You came out with growing up in the shadows of 9/11 and what that means. I'm just curious to know, like, you being from a different faith, what prompted you to cover this and tackle this issue? Because it's not something that you can say that you were initially affected by it, but I'm sure there's some kind of connection that you have in this work that you've done.
Yeah, for sure. So I was 6 when 9/11 happened. So I guess, and I grew up in New York. So there was I do, as everyone, has their story. Like, I remember being young, and I remember like not grasping like the full impact or implications of the tragedy. But I think what drew me to telling the story is just the fact that, as I was saying before, like there is no media diversity. We lack voices from marginalized groups. And even though I'm from a different faith, being a Latina and Lebanese woman in the industry, still dealing with like that underrepresentation. And I know that if these stories don't get told, it's just so much, it leads to erasure in politics and policy, in the validation of people's lives. And I knew that the 20th anniversary was coming up for 9/11, and I just wanted to use my platform that I have. The section I write for is called Voices of Color. So we generally write about, communities of color and underrepresented groups. And I just wanted to use that platform to tell the story, because if there's not someone at the table who's kind of keyed in, then these stories just don't get told. And obviously, it's a learning curve, right? I learned a lot from reporting the story, and learned a lot about a community that I don't belong to. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us, right? These are not niche stories. These are, stories of human beings. And I think, when we kind of get out of the mindset and we tell these different stories, we just come to understand collectively as a society that all of our struggles are interconnected, that we are all human beings connected by the same struggles, the same pain, the same joys. And I just wanted to, I think it's just so important to dispel stereotypes. And I know the media plays a huge role in propelling those stereotypes. So it was, it was really, honestly, an honor to hear from the people I spoke to, for them to share these really intimate and painful moments with me, and to also share, what they're doing about it and how they are trying to change things for the people who come after them and their communities.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That was beautiful, and seeing someone actually humanize our stories in their own way, I think resonates with all of our faith, regardless of where we're from and what we're doing. It humanizes our experiences, and it shows people that things can transcend beyond being someone of the same label, regardless of the background or the religion. And I think you embody that. So I want to commend you for that and the work that you've done for our community. Rana, I'm going to move it over to you because I know I'm trying to keep everyone's time in respect. This conversation can go on and on with you amazing women and the work that you guys done. But I'm going to end it with a question with you in terms of the importance of being civically engaged and the American Muslim community being involved in that and why it's necessary. We've seen so many things going on about people misrepresenting Muslims in all different aspects. But I just want to know, like, as a Muslim woman, we're seeing 20 years later and seeing the effects of what has happened. But why is it so important for American Muslims to be civically engaged?
Thank you for that question. It's my favorite question. I really do believe deeply in Muslim civic engagement and political participation. I come from a community that is working class, that has not been engaged through the electoral process. And I see how powerful it is when my community sees themselves being represented in some way, being active through my campaign and seeing and beginning to develop their own political voice through the electoral process. And we see it happening, right, at a federal level, at local levels, what impact it does have when we have a diversity of leadership. We're able to have conversations in ways that for the first time ever feel representative of communities that have been so disenfranchised for so long. We have someone like Cori Bush who's going to sit on the steps, right, to make sure that we have an eviction moratorium. We're going to have representatives who are going to make sure that they're having a foreign policy that is more reflective of human rights and of social justice. And I think it's so important for us to have that level of representation as people in the United States when the U.S. has such an important role to play, both domestically and abroad. And so I'm really happy to be going through this process right now. It's definitely harder, I think, for me as a hijab-wearing Muslim woman. And I've watched how Ilhan Omar has navigated as well the political space. And the ways in which narratives have been used against her. And I think it makes it even more important because we know that that's how much of a difference it will make.
Thank you. That was beautiful. And I loved what you had to say. And bravo to you and your will to go through with this, because I'm sure it's not easy, like you said. And I wish you all the best. I really want to thank each and every one of you, Sanya, Gwen, Noreen, Rania, Senator Hashmi, for joining us for this amazing discussion. I hope that in the near future we can come back and talk a little bit more about the great work you guys are doing so that more people can be familiar that the space is being taken by amazing women who are just powerhouses in their own way and amazingly pushing us to the future in a way that we haven't seen before. So I commend each and every one of you, and I thank you so much. And God bless all of you in the work that you're doing. And I hope one day I get to meet each and every one of you in person. So if you're ever up in Northern Virginia, reach out to me. I would love to grab some lunch or dinner with you guys. And on behalf of everyone at the American Muslim Institution, I want to thank you guys so much for joining us for this amazing conversation. And thank Shahid Rahman, our executive director, and all the board members at AMI. We hope that you have a great afternoon, evening, lunch, breakfast, anywhere you are. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you guys soon. Take care.